So let's keep moving along here. There's actually technically a fourth mechanism for running test methods. And the fourth mechanism is when you deploy your code, it will run your test methods. So that is my fantastic segue to the topic of deployment. All right, so one of the things that we're going to cover deployment just in general, a little bit about talking about different techniques and different processes and procedures and how they map to the force.com world. So our production organizations are the runtime environment for our code, right? Keep in mind that anytime you deploy code to the force.com, your production system, or for that matter, any system, it's going to execute. So the next request that comes in, if you create a trigger, that's going to fire that off. Now, one of the things that surrounds this is that you should have sort of a controlled deployment process that goes into any time you are, for instance, developing code within your sandboxes, maybe performing different types of testing, and then ultimately moving it into your production environment. So the advantage of using this is that you can make sure that, for instance, if you have multiple developers, your code integrates properly. You might be doing load testing. You also want to identify problems with the deployment process, or essentially things that might happen that prevent you from getting your code in there, and I'll talk about a few of those things. So here's a graphic showing our typical deployment scenario. Now it's not, I wouldn't say typical necessarily, but it's a very simplistic graph here, where each box represents a different environment. So if the blue and the yellow ones were sandboxes, and then the green one was the actual production org that we were going to deploy to, and then possibly the training, it might be, probably would be another sandbox. Well, what would happen within this org, or within this organization, is that the developers might each have a sandbox for them to write code and perform their own tests and create their own unit tests. Then they would take the code that they have and then deploy it to another sandbox, and the purpose of this sandbox would be to perform integration testing. Okay? So then we would go through a battery of tests to make sure that the code works together. Possibly would have multiple, code coming from multiple sources, or for that matter, not even necessarily code per se. It could be changes to things like workflow rules, custom objects, fields, so on and so forth. Then in our staging environment, we might perform yet another set of tests. We might be doing load testing, user acceptance testing, regression testing, testing of specific new features. So there are many different types of tests that you can perform associated with the deployment process. But there may or may not be, or there may be one or many sandboxes that you're utilizing for testing before you then push it up to production. But ultimately, we're going to finally push this into production, and then what we're going to do is, at that point, we're deploying the code to production, and we're going to be running that test, or we're going to be executing the unit test, and it's that point which we're going to require that 75% coverage and also the code completing without uncaught exceptions. So some of the things that people might do, an important part of rolling out new applications or changing functionality within applications is to do user testing. So there's a couple of options that you have for user testing, and this kind of shows you the two different ways that you can go about creating training sandboxes for the purposes of your users. One would be to deploy data and metadata to yet another sandbox, which would be used for the purpose of training. Or you could deploy your latest code to the production org and then create a sandbox from that production org and then allow your users to then go in and use that as the training environment. So there's a few different ways you can approach this, and there are sort of benefits and drawbacks to each. So understand that you can do it two different ways, where you're either creating a copy of your production or simply creating a new sandbox based on the tested code. When you then deploy to your production environment, we're then going to perform that 75% coverage test. Now it says Apex can never be directly written to a production environment. Now the way that we prevent people from writing business logic directly into their production environment is that that code that's being saved must meet that requirement for test coverage. Okay, it's at that point when you're pushing it into that production environment that we then will run the tests associated with the code, and your code in general, in total, must meet that 75% requirement. It's not for that specific class. If you're only deploying one class and one test class, it's a global or a total number that we're executing. Every trigger, we also mentioned every trigger must have some test coverage, compile, and then no problems with our code. All right. When we're doing the deployment, there are three tools that we can utilize to do that deployment. The first is the Force.com IDE. The Force.com IDE, I'll show you this in a demo later on. We have the facility where we have a facility to perform the deployment to the production environment using that. There's also the Force.com migration tool. This is a tool that runs on top of Ant. Ant is an Apache project written in Java, and it allows you to automate processes. Finally, there are third-party tools in which we can deploy metadata to our production org, and one of them is Dream Factory Snapshot. The thing about a lot of people, at least in my experience, some people prefer the Dream Factory Snapshot versus the Force.com IDE. It does a lot of additional things. For instance, it has a fairly nice side-by-side view. The drawback is that it does cost money in order to use this tool. So as opposed to the Force.com IDE, which is free, the Dream Factory Snapshot does have a license fee. When we are deploying via the Force.com IDE, I'll show you, we can right-click on our project and then select Deploy to Server. This will then bring up a window whereby we can fill out connection parameters for deploying to that server or to that target org. So if we think about all the work that we've been doing in class so far, all the work we've been doing is in a project that's connected up to a sandbox. Now we're going to select Deploy to Server, but instead of entering in sandbox connection parameters, we're going to enter in production org parameters or login credentials. Okay. So we would enter in username and password, and possibly if we're outside of the trusted IP range, security token, and then we would select Production Developer Edition as opposed to Sandbox. There's a couple of archives that can optionally be created. When we're deploying to a production org, we can do a backup of the metadata. And so there's two options. We can create a zip file of the current or local project, and we can also create a zip file or archive of the target org that we're deploying to. So this would be, the destination archive is the more important of the two, because it's here that we can then make a copy of the current state of that target org, so that we could have something that we could, if we needed to fall back, we would then have an archive which would essentially be the project that is normally stored in your Eclipse workspace. It's basically an archive that contains that directory structure. Okay. But that's what those are. That's two archive files that contain your project metadata contents. Then ultimately we're going to get to the point where we are going to deploy this to the production org by selecting which metadata components, which components we want to push up to that production environment. Now in our case, we're going to be able to do this because you don't have to deploy everything at once. So what's going to happen is that a window will pop up, much like this one, and I'll show you this in a bit, but what you're able to do is see the items that will be added, the items that will be overwritten, and then optionally items that you might want to delete from the target org. And then we can select, using the checkboxes, a subset, or we can select everything in terms of what we would like to overwrite or add to that target org. Okay. There's also a very important button, which is the Validate Deployment button. Now, often there will be a number of problems that you'll run into in pushing your metadata up to the target org. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to step out here for a second and do a little whiteboarding, or I'm sorry, not whiteboarding, but draw a little something on this chart here. So there's a few specific problems that you'll encounter when deploying to a production org that you need to watch out for. The first is that the metadata API. So problem number one is that there's less than 100% coverage in the metadata API. So what I'm referring to here is that the metadata API in its current form does not cover all of the different components that you could create through the setup menu, or for that matter, within the setup menu. So let me give you an example. So a queue, which is something that you can create within the tool. You associate it with some objects, you assign users to that queue. You cannot define a queue within the context of the Force.com IDE. And the reason is that the metadata API does not support the definition of a queue using that API. Okay? A lot of the time when we're talking about our controlled deployment process, what we're talking about is identifying things like queues. Another one would be time-based workflow. The time triggers currently aren't supported by the metadata API. You would need to identify what are the things that we've created in the sandboxes that we need to now manually create over in our target production org. All right. The second problem, or the second big problem that you're going to run into, is org-specific data in the metadata. So another issue is that, let's say you're going to, you've created a workflow action, and one of the things that you're doing is that you're sending, or you're doing an email alert, and so you're sending it to a specific user. Well, if you created this within the context of your sandbox, that user is identified by their login name, and keep in mind that in a sandbox, all those users' login names end in .devorg. In your production org that you are then pushing this up to, there is no such thing as a user whose account ID ends in .devorg, right? So now inside of our metadata, we are referencing something that does not exist within the org that we're deploying to. I'll talk about how you deal with that, but it requires us to handle that situation. All right, and then the thing that makes this the most fun is that we have dependencies. Sometimes you'll get into sort of you know, I guess you'd call them chicken and egg type problems, where especially if we're talking about a queue. So if you think about a queue, let's say we have a custom object and a queue, and so we want to deploy both of them. Well, we can't deploy the or we can't create the queue until the custom object is created. And then often there'll be some sort of third thing that's referencing that queue or something like that. Like, for instance, you might have a workflow that's then changing the owner to the queue, so it's referencing the queue. So you get these kind of things where these dependencies create these sort of chicken and egg problems, where you catch yourself in a position where you can't, you have to create a workaround in order to get past that particular situation. Okay. So what would you do in these situations? So how would you handle these problems? Well, what you need to do is, first of all, we talked about how with a less than 100% coverage in the metadata API, you'd want to go into the target production org and manually recreate these things. In addition, the org-wide specific data, in the case of using the force.com ID, what I do is I switch it into the work offline mode. I then make changes to the metadata, and I'll remove the .devorg from the end of the user ID, and then using that copy that's been fixed, then deploy that to the target production org. Okay. When dealing with the dependencies, at least some of the dependencies I've run across, in describing that situation with the custom objects and the queues, I've found a pretty simple workaround, which is to create or manually define the custom object, then create the queue that references the custom object, and then instead of using the deploy tool to add the custom object, what I've done is to then overwrite the existing empty custom object definition with everything that I have now that was actually all my fields and all my things that make my object purposeful and useful. Okay, so it's not, I wouldn't call it rocket science, because it's not, at the end of the day, there's a very helpful log file that's generated, and especially when we're talking about things like dependencies, it just tells you, I need this and I couldn't find this. And so it's pretty, if you just sort of work your way through it, it's not hard to figure out what you need to do to make this work. Okay. The log files are very helpful in telling you, here's the dependency that I need and I don't have it, and then therefore create it manually or do something along those lines for a workaround. Okay? All right. Okay, so hopefully you hit the point where then we're going to get this success. Notice that there's also the view logs. So when I was referring to the fact that we have log files that tell you where the problems are, those are very helpful. You can copy them to the clipboard, paste them into a text file, but those are what you're going to need to utilize in order to get through those current limitations. Okay. All right, the force.com migration tool. The force.com migration tool is the Ant-based command line tool that we have available. Ant itself is a very extensible tool. You can create your own custom actions, and that's exactly what, or I should say tasks, create your own custom types of tasks, but that's exactly what we've done at Salesforce. A little bit of I mean, this is an extremely high-level explanation of the way Ant works, but there is a build.properties file which contains login information for accessing the target org that you are deploying to. There are things like the build.xml, which contains what you want performed. This is an XML file in which you identify what tasks you would like performed as a part of this automation script. Now, what we've done in extending Ant via the force.com migration tool is to add 2 additional tasks. They are deploy and retrieve. Deploy is writing your data from taking the file-based format and then writing it up to the target org. Retrieve is the opposite, connecting up to an org and then copying down the metadata in the file format. Retrieve is also has probably another purpose, which is you might want to automate nightly backups of different orgs by retrieving the metadata definitions and then maybe checking them into a source code repository, doing something like that. Ant also has integration with source code repositories to write the data or retrieve the data from those systems. At the end of the day, though, like I said, it's something that can be executed as a part of a batch file or something along those lines from a command shell. You would execute the target, which would indicate the different tasks that you would like to automate, like, for instance, deploying our metadata up to our target or retrieving it from somewhere else. And then finally, Dream Factory has a tool called Snapshot. Snapshot, like I said, has a few cool features that the Force.com IDE does not have. Like I said, the drawback is that it does cost money, so there is a license fee associated with it. So, all right, so let me show you using, at least within the Force.com IDE, go through a quick demo of deploying to a target org. So one of the things I could do is to, within the Force.com IDE, right-click and select Force.com, and then select the Deploy to Server option in order to take some of my metadata and to deploy it to that target org. It takes a little bit while because it's going to connect up. Let's see here, connecting up to the. We'll connect up to the server in a second. On a side note, while we're waiting for this to complete, I'd also like to mention that people also create projects that, different from ours, only contain a subset of their metadata. So when you're defining your projects, don't fall into the trap of thinking you need to download all of the metadata. You can identify a subset, or for that matter, create an empty project and then create new items that you would ultimately deploy. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect up to a different org, which is admin@dev501.1079.com. Here's the password, and in this case, this is a production developer org. So here are the credentials for the target org that I'm deploying to, which is, like I said, different than the one that I'm currently connected to in my project. That's my sandbox. All right, I have the option of creating the project archive or the destination archive. So I'm going to uncheck both of these just for the sake of speed. So it takes a little bit longer to create that archive, so I'm going to skip that step. But if you're doing in the real world, please remember to select the destination archive to get a backup of the metadata contained within the target org. All right, so now what I'm doing is, in clicking the Next button, it is doing a comparison between the definitions that exist within the local definitions in my project, in other words, all the XML files and so on, compared to the metadata definitions in the target org that I'm deploying to. Anything that exists within my local files, my local workspace, is going to be identified here as green. In other words, it's something I can add to the target org. And then if I scroll down, you'll see that there's also yellow. Yellow indicates that the definition of what I have is, I have both, in both locations. I have in this case, these workflows in both locations, but the definitions differ. So in this case, I'm overriding it and it's making a change to it. And then finally, the gray represents they exist in both locations, but there's no difference between them. Notice that those are not checked by default because it's really not necessary to upload those. In the case of something that is, in my case I don't have it, but if I had something in the target org that did not exist in my local repository, then I would have the red option of deleting the remote, whatever it is, and removing it from that environment. There's a select all and a deselect all. I'm going to do the deselect all. And what I can do is I can go in here and now pick and choose what I'd like to work with. Just so you know, in helping you to utilize this, you can sort by column, and I find this extremely helpful because one of the things that you're going to want to do is to organize based on the type of component. So in this case here, I'm organizing it, or I sorted it based on the type, and so it's from Apex class down to, it's alphabetically sorted. But here I can see, like for instance, here are all my different triggers. In this case, what you're going to do is you're going to go through here and select some different things, like for instance, in this case, here's my, let's see here, where's my hello rolled. There it is. So my hello world position class and my hello world test class, and then the position object. So if I scroll down to custom objects, so here's my custom object, and then here's my position object. All right. All right. So now I can go out here and validate this deployment. So like I said, this is an important part here, because now it's going to test this to see if this would successfully deploy to the target server. So, okay. So this is executing, and it's going to come back either with some errors, or it's going to come back with some with a success. So in this case, let's see here. It looks like I have some sort of problem with some labels, what you'd want to do, take these error messages and then go through and figure out what it is, what is the sort of the hill you need to get over in order to make this successfully succeed. So, successfully succeed, I just invented a great phrase. Yeah. All right. All right. There's also the view logs button. This is great because there's this save and then the copy to clipboard. Often one of the things that you're going to want to do is to paste this into a text file so you can later refer to it, possibly email it to a coworker, whatever it may be, but take a look at that. Okay. All right. So that's that is our the deploy process. Okay. So why don't we open up the floor to any questions that you might have?
Maybe you just answer it. There's nothing that stops us from. This is a sandbox org of one org, but you're deploying it to another.
Yeah.
So there's nothing that stops us doing that.
Okay, so the question is, what's stopping us from deploying from our sandbox to our production org?
Different production org. Like this is a sandbox copy of dev501.com.dev.
Yes, yeah.
But you're deploying it to dev501.1079. The two orgs have nothing in common.
Yes.
And we have a lot of customers who have multiple orgs.
Oh, and so how to deploy to multiple orgs?
No.
Or
Is
okay.
there nothing that stops us from deploying to a different org?
No. I mean, the key thing that we have to prevent people from accessing those are the security credentials that we require. In addition, the things like the trusted IP ranges and stuff like that. But that is the, our traditional security challenges that we put out there are the barrier between getting the code and then deploying it to production. So I guess what maybe one thing to mention is that an organization might have a gatekeeper, and maybe there's only a couple of people who have that system administrator level of access to the production org or orgs. The developers do not have that level of access, and so they would take the deployment plan, and they would take the metadata and hand it over to a person who would fulfill the role of the deployer. They're the gatekeeper in the production org for then taking that work and ultimately deploying it up to production, you know, on some Saturday night or whatever it may be. Is that answering your question, or okay?
This is not creating any link between the sandbox org and the production org. It's just a whole deployment, a whole bunch of codes pushed out, and that's about it.
So the question is this creating any sort of link or anything along those lines? It's not. So we're simply, I mean, this comes down to the fact that our metadata is stored in a file format, and we're taking those metadata definitions and deploying them up to production. But in of them themselves, the metadata is just a definition of, for instance, a custom object or an Apex class, and what that Apex class or what that custom object will do. There is no, you know, once you create that sandbox, there's kind of a unidirectional communication, in the sense that when you create a sandbox, there's that communication from the production to the sandbox, but there's no sort of reverse sort of, whatever the opposite of sandbox to production. The mechanism by which we get stuff from sandbox back to production is by using this these metadata API enabled tools. Okay.
So when we do releases, right, the production org might be at a different release than the sandbox org.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, when I'm doing the deployment, would it fail just because they are on different releases, or it would fail only if there are certain custom fields that it finds in the sandbox and which are no longer on the production org, or stuff like that?
Okay, so I think if I understand the question correctly, if maybe the production org is at a later version than the metadata associated with the sandbox. Okay, so maybe it's in our source code repository or whatever it may be, and then we're in that case, I don't think there's going to be an issue, because, for instance, with our Apex classes, you know, assuming that there hasn't been some sort of change to the metadata API, keeping in mind that things like the Apex classes, they simply have the version that they're associated with it stored as a part of the metadata. It's a little bit weird, because we have an Apex class in and of itself is a piece of metadata, but associated with it is a metadata file. So there's metadata about metadata. So just to show you, if we take a look at any of our classes, for instance, there's the candidate key class, but then there's also the candidate key metadata XML file associated with that. I don't think there would be an issue. I can't say that, they haven't run into issues. They probably have, knowing Murphy's Law, but I don't, unless the metadata API definition has been updated, I don't think it should cause any problems. And I wish I could, and now I'm thinking, boy, when I, as a part of I want to say as a part of upgrading Eclipse from one version to another, and by that I mean the force.com ID that we release, I believe we did a conversion of the project files from one version to a later version. I am not 100% on that. It happened 3 months or 4 months ago. Has anyone else, since we, has anyone else seen that? I want to say that it did something along those lines, but let me look that one up just to get the for sure answer. So I don't think it should be an issue, but let me look that one up.
I can answer some of it.
Okay, yeah, so there's, okay, so just to reiterate what, or to restate what Deepa said, so there's no forward compatibility in the sense that Salesforce upgrades half of the instances one weekend, and then upgrades the other set of instances the other weekend. And you could have a situation in which your sandbox is actually on a later version than your production environment. In fact, one of the things that I think I know what might create this issue is that when you create a new class within the force.com ID, you can't create a new class and set it equal to the previous version when you create it. So maybe that's what customers have run into, is the only way that they can create a class is at 16.0 if their sandbox has already been updated, and we don't support forward compatibility in the production org in the sense that it's running at 15.0.
Can you just create a new class for us?
Sure. So we can create a new class.
15.0. This
But
one's
that's-
16.0.
Well, that's because, okay.
Production, we are at 16.0.
I'm running the version 15.0 of the force.com IDE right now. Yeah.
So if you would create any new classes at 16.0, and if production was not at 16.0, you wouldn't be able to upload them.
Yeah. Okay. So if I had the version 16.0 of the force.com IDE, but my org was still at 15.0, I could not push those up there. Am I correct in? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So once again, we're getting into the forward compatibility situation. In my case, I have the last release version of the force.com IDE installed on my laptop, and that's why the only thing that I see is version 15.0, even though both of my orgs that I have here are at version 16.0. So, but one thing to point out is that it's not giving me the opportunity to set this equal to previous versions. I've noticed that when creating new classes, it doesn't allow me to go back and associate with 14.0 or 13.0 or whatever. All right. Any other questions?
How do you do a rollback if something happens in a rollback?
So the question is, how would you perform a rollback? And you'd need to redeploy the older version of your metadata to the org. There's not sort of a one thing that Salesforce does not do is we do not have previous versions of metadata that are available for you to roll back to. So there's not multiple versions of a class that you're working on or anything like that. You'd have to take the previous version and then redeploy it back up to production.
For more information on Salesforce.com training and certification, please visit www.salesforce.com/training.